This is a great honor to be here. It's my second time in Australia and my first time in Sydney. And this attending the past kind of day and a half has been making me feel a little bit like this. This is my favorite picture of a cat, and he just definitely doesn't look like he's the smartest, cat around. This kind of staring out into the distance. And that's partly because I've been hearing about fantastic technologies that you guys are using on a day-to-day basis, but also because I'm a little bit jet-lagged. So this talk is a result of both things. It's also the worst possible slot ever because it's right after lunch. So I thought I'd start by talking about sex, just to wake everybody up. So about 3 years ago, I guess, this is the Fitbit. This is the first version of the Fitbit. If you don't know what the Fitbit is, it's a thing you plug on yourself, and then it looks at your activity and allows you to make better judgment about how much you're walking, running, etc., and just keep track. And about 3 years ago, when they were first starting to launch this, they gave people this little device. You could clip it on kind of anything, so it wasn't just a bracelet. It also wasn't necessarily super obvious where it was, because you could clip it, underneath your clothing, whatever. But it gave you a graph of your activity, and then you could tag that graph. And they thought, as a good San Francisco-based startup, they thought this was going to be awesome. People are just going to tag it with their activity and what they're doing. And of course, their activity also includes sex. And so people started tagging when they were having intercourse with their partner. And the company hadn't necessarily expected that to happen. And so they certainly hadn't expected it to be something they had to design around. So when you Googled someone for about 2 days, I can't remember when, you saw this little graph. And the tags that they'd used for that graph in the last 24 hours showed up. So in the search result, you could see when the last time that person, was having fun. Of course, they shut that down really quickly. They put in a whole bunch of security sort of layers on top of that, and then now it's impossible for you to see that data and have access to that data. But this is sort of indicative of the wild, wild west we're in right now, which is where people are still trying to figure this out, which is why I've kind of renamed my talk, Recalculating. Because we're trying to figure our way out through an area that is emerging and devices that are sort of coming up and are things that you're going to buy and you're going to buy into, but without necessarily having thought too much about the data layer and the data implications. And I think that there's both space for thinking about the user, but also thinking about things from the data perspective. A little bit about me. I'm based in London, thus the jet lag. And I started in this world sort of becoming the first distributor of the Arduino platform in the UK. Raise your hand if you know what an Arduino is. Keep your hand up if you've actually bought one. Keep your hand up if you've actually used it. Okay, cool, thanks. And so we distributed the Arduino. I sent them from my bedroom in Hackney in East London for about 6 months, hired some people in to help me do that, ran some workshops, ended up creating a whole series of design services on top of the Arduino to get people to understand what you could do with these newfangled technologies. And that studio was called Tinker. The account is still up. We closed that business end of 2010, and then I became a consultant around this space again. But I hate being a consultant, so I decided to have a startup around this space, which is called the Goodnight Lamp. And the Goodnight Lamp is a family of internet-connected lamps. You have a big lamp and a little lamp, so you give the little lamps away to anyone around the world, and when you turn the big lamp on, the little one turns on. A very simple way of indicating to someone that you're around, you're available for a Skype call, you're okay, you're home, you're safe. So kind of like the Facebook status, put into the real world. So what I wanted to talk about is, based on this experience from the sort of hardware all the way to something consumer-friendly, let's call it, I want to talk about what the Internet of Things is. So for those of you who've heard the word but don't necessarily know what it means, and also what data does to that concept of the Internet of Things, how you can get involved, and also why you should get involved, you who are mostly concerned with building digital things. Because I think that what you're doing is really valuable to what people like me are doing, and I think there should be more cross-collaboration. So this is from James Bridle, a friend of mine who's spoken at this conference twice before. So I feel like I'm in his living room somehow. And the idea of the web as being something virtual is obviously a lie. You know, there are data centers. This stuff takes space in the universe, and we query it constantly. And depending on where it is, it takes more or less time. Here, it takes a lot of time. And the difference is that now, actually, that hardware is getting cheaper and more accessible. So the Arduino platform, which I talked about, this is a super early version. You won't even see this anymore. This is like the quickest picture I could download from the internet here. And this is, 15 pounds, which I guess would be whatever, 20 Australian dollars. You have 6 distributors in Australia right now where you can buy this. And this allows you to get involved in building something that might talk to the web in a very, very simple way. So making an HTTP request from an Arduino will take you 20 minutes. And then you'll have something where you press a button in the real world and it maybe moves something online. Or vice versa, you can pull something from the internet and then it blinks a light every time you get a, GitHub change or whatever it might be. 20 minutes. 20 minutes for you to get involved in that world. And that's really radically different from what it used to be when I started getting involved in that space at all. And the way in which I kind of try to explain the Internet of Things changes all the time, but what I think I always mean is this idea of embedded connectivity everywhere. And it has to be open, but I'll talk about the open bit in a little while. So embedded meaning that, if you've got an embedded or an Internet of Things product, it's going to have some electronics hidden underneath it or designed within it in some capacity. It's going to be able to talk to the web in a way that isn't necessarily super obvious right now. And that connectivity can take various different forms. You can pick the technology you prefer. It's kind of a no man's land when you talk to people in that world about which one is best. You can pick whatever you like. Low energy Bluetooth is super exciting now because that's what Apple have decided to promote. But obviously Zigbee has been around for a really long time and Wi-Fi is still there. Oop, I shut it down. Oh, sorry. And then everywhere, meaning boring stuff, really, really boring stuff, like your cup holder and your chairs and, your plants, like really, really boring stuff. So not only devices, but everyday objects that you sort of have completely forgotten about. And there are reasons why we forget about everyday objects, because they already fulfill the function that is to do whatever it is that they need to do. And somehow the Internet of Things brings that back in the forefront. And there are good things about that and bad things about that. Things that people have designed through the years have been multiple. I mean, you can Google kind of anything you like, and someone has attempted to connect it up to the internet. Whether they've turned it into a consumer product you can actually buy is a whole other question, but that is where the Wild Wild West aspect of this comes in. So you've got Nike Plus, which was really early on. The top middle one is called Molly, and this is a little robot that hooks up to your laptop, and every time you get a retweet on Twitter, a little bubble gum comes out, which is super sweet. The Nabas tag, which I don't know whether it ever made it over here, but top right is an internet-connected rabbit. So it came with a broadband subscription in France, and you had 2 rabbits. You could send a rabbit to someone else, and when you moved the ears of one rabbit, then the corresponding rabbit's ears moved as well. And this is 2007. This is at a time where people were, already sort of getting used to the idea of a smartphone, getting used to the idea of Wi-Fi everywhere, and this became very, very popular. Funnily enough, and also a little bit sadly enough, with kids who had divorced parents. So the rabbit would sit in the bedroom of the kid, and then the other rabbit would be in the other parent's, apartment somewhere else. And so they had this medium of communication that was nonverbal, non-intrusive. It meant that the parent didn't have to talk to the other parent, and all those things. And there's a need for that, and that they fulfilled a user need and a user story. The middle one at the left is called Teddo the Bear. This is super interesting, and the story behind that particular company is super interesting because it proves that people are still kind of iterating around this field. Teddo the bear is a teddy bear that you use to play a game on an iPad. So it's essentially a fluffy Wii controller. And they've tried different versions of their same technology, and they've tried to push this over and try to see if it sticks, and none of it really sticks, particularly because they're trying to retrofit technology where it maybe doesn't need to be, retrofitted at all. A teddy bear is a perfectly good thing by itself. It doesn't necessarily need storytelling attached to an iPad, but it could mean that it needs storytelling in another way. You could make it talk, you could make it replicate someone's voice, whatever it might be. People have tried to do this in the toy industry for a really long time. There are reasons why it's successful in some instances and not in others. But you're sort of stuck with this thing that is this object that already works really well, and you're having to do and think about new interactions and create those new interactions. The oldest company to have been involved in this world is the middle bit, which is the Umbrella. Ambient Devices is an American company that's been working around this space since 2005, more or less. And the Ambient Umbrella is very simple. It glows when you need to take your umbrella because it's going to rain. In some parts of the world, that is completely irrelevant, like in London, where it rains all the time, and so you just take your umbrella every day of your life. In California, it's super relevant because it may or may not happen that often. Here, I'm not sure. I think it varies. And then you have super new little startups in London like Bleep Bleeps, which is the bottom right. They are Internet of Things connected sort of toys and products for parents. So they have an in-ear sort of thermometer. They've got little printers to sort of help you with monitoring your child and different interactions that a parent actually might want because they've got a child in their hand and they don't have time to check on the internet on their phone or whatever it is because they're completely overwhelmed. And so these guys are addressing that problem with something that, quite frankly, looks cute and looks really nice. And then a little printer. I don't know if you guys have been exposed to this yet. So top left is a product by some friends of mine in London called Berg Studio. And they've built a little tiny internet-connected, basically a kind of ticker tape printer. And so you have publications you can sign up to, you can schedule them, and then he prints them out on a little receipt printer. And so it's no bigger than the receipts you'd get, but you can get fun things like, alerts on New York Times, or you can get Spanish word of the day, or Chinese word of the day, whatever it might be. They've got thousands of publications. You can kind of pick and choose. So it's your own little newspaper every day of your life, which is great. I have one at home. It's fantastic. And then August, which is a startup that is doing really well, which is a way of protecting your home when you're away from home. So giving people access to your home because you might be renting it on Airbnb, different types of interactions. Basically, there's tons of this stuff. So they're there, and these companies are emerging, and they'll start, selling things at large distributors, and your grandmother will start buying them, and what are the implications, and how do we have to sort of move forward, and how can you guys get involved? Every single presentation I've ever seen in the last kind of day and a half mentions data, so I have two. I think that we have to start with something simple. So let's start with a intelligence scale. So you've got a scale that tells you how much weight, what your weight is, and allows you to track your weight over time. This is a little text heavy, you'll have to excuse that. But imagine that you have that scale, and then someone hacks that scale in some way, has access to that data, and then can tell that actually you're not, you're kind of slim enough that if someone really, really big came into your home and tried to steal your stuff, then you'd never resist, you'd never be able to kind of get away from that, and so you could easily be robbed because you wouldn't be able to protect yourself. Random example or random use case, but that's some of the things that people can do. Imagine that someone had access to that data and started cross-selling you a whole bunch of services. So you walk in to a place and you check in on Foursquare, and then Foursquare goes, hey, I can tell you're trying to lose weight. You might want to order the salad here because it's very good, and your friends have said that the salad is very good. You might, end up sort of having that data kind of floating around, and so your local gym knows that you're one of many who have lost about 15% of their weight in the last couple of months, so they might want to introduce sort of more promotions for you to renew your membership because they know how well you're doing, and so they can encourage you with more ads for whatever they're doing. And so your data sort of suddenly floats outside of that particular object and starts to provide you with services that you may or may not want to ever interact with, because all you're trying to do is just do well and lose some weight, maybe. And so the idea of, how we usually try to think about that is we usually try to think about that in terms of data protection. So we have the Data Protection Act, we have the Consumer Protection Act, and we have acts that look at data in a very sort of web-centric way. But this is, we're out in the real world, we're out kind of with that data that sort of floats around to all these third parties, and we are more or less aware of what's going on, because really we've got an object at home and we've got a mobile phone, and that's all we have. And there are lots of little mechanisms that we can start to sort of design for in this world that's a little bit more tricky. So you should be able to, have your own data, but also sell it to whoever wants it, because they're actually asking you for it. So they go and, you get prompted saying, hey, there's a third party that would love to use your data because let's say that Zara is trying to ascertain whether they should stock more medium size or large size this season, so they want to know how people are doing generally and how people, how large is the general population. And then you can go, don't make it my problem. No, thank you. Or you can go, yeah, sure, okay, I'd rather they stock my size than pretending like they stock, they have to stock everybody's size when actually no one ever fits into an X small. And so this idea of this interaction, this conversation, hasn't been designed at all right now. And the only thing that's ever been designed when you talk about a product is really, you turn over any product that you have access to, and usually what you'll get is the little recycle sign for it. So you'll get a recycle sign and then PE or PT and whatever the material is that's recyclable. That's about the only thing that the industry has been able to sort of wrap their heads around, is this idea of, okay, well, maybe we should make sure this thing gets recycled. And really what we're talking about is maybe there should also be a URL for that product. So at the bottom of every connected product, you should have like, okay, well, your data is going to be stored here. And we don't know who you are necessarily because you haven't filled in a form when you've bought your razor blades, but the data around those razor blades will be stored here. And then maybe you can claim it. Maybe you can say like, okay, this is me, this is my pack, because I'm trying to monitor how often I use my razor blades, or I know it's super expensive, or I'm picking that as a random example. You can apply that to anything you can think of that's in your home right now. Maybe you want to get that company to send you refills of whatever it is that you're constantly running out of because you always forget to buy it in the first place. So you'd rather have it sent to you in the post, in the same way that people get sent coffee, So, and it's sort of this idea of the private and public is really interesting. So it's your own data, but it plays a larger piece in this whole idea of society and public space. And so this is called the Air Quality Egg, which is a project that was done almost entirely on Google Groups. And it's a collaborative project. They had some Kickstarter money, and it's an air quality monitor. So you hang it up, and it looks at your air quality around you in your home, in your environment, and then you can share that on a map with everybody else. And what that means is my data is interesting, but it's not as interesting as everybody else's data. And I want to see that, and I want to be able to have access to it, and I want to be able to make decisions about this. When we live in an environment that's fairly, okay in terms of air quality, that doesn't really matter. But in China right now, parents are making decisions around where to put their kids based on the air quality inside the school. And so for those parents, that data becomes really relevant and really important. And so it's not about the self, it's about the community, it's about the whole, it's about trends within that whole. Another wonderful project is called the Japan Geiger Maps. So when Fukushima happened, a friend of mine, Haiyan Zhang, who was running OpenIDEO, which is this sort of project-driven side of IDEO, which is a design consultancy, she decided, okay, well, let's play around with this idea of what data means, because collective data and societal data is often driven by governments. So governments were saying, oh yeah, no, there's almost no, there are no problems with Fukushima, everything's fine. All the hackers in Japan went out and bought Geiger counters and started posting that online, and she created a map for it. And they found that the amount of, what's the word? Thank you. The amount of radiation that was coming out from around the area was, tenfold more than what the government were saying. The government was kind of sending people once in a while to take readings, and there were people who weren't talking to any of the locals. They would kind of go in and do their little thing and then go out again and not speak to anybody. And so everybody just started mapping this en masse. You couldn't find a Geiger counter to buy online anywhere for a really long time, for months and months. And so they were able to actually force the government into admitting that the data that they were taking was firstly published inaccurately, but also that it wasn't even published in the right way. It was published as PDFs. It was just kind of posted up on the government website and like, knock yourself out. And they were actually taking such great data that actually changed, the government had to actually respond to this. And this is, very bottom up, but it is very much about, my data is important because it allows this greater conversation about what we're doing and what's happening geopolitically as well. And the idea of anonymity, of course, should always be built in, but also the idea that maybe I'm okay with you using my data, but I'm okay with you using my data if it's on a certain scale. So I'm okay with you using my weight as data, but only, my weight every 6 months, or my weight every year, to add to like census data, for example. But I'm not okay with you taking the reading every day while I'm taking that reading myself. And that, again, that conversation doesn't exist right now. So what does this mean for business? Who here, raise your hand if you're involved in shipping atoms in any fashion? 1, 2-ish, 3-ish, 4-ish. Ugh, okay. So for your types of companies, it's going to be super interesting because it means that not only are you going to have to redesign the user experience around how people see your product, because eventually if you decide to ship a internet-connected product, then you have a completely different conversation with an end customer. But also the e-commerce experience becomes completely different. You have to, sort of start to build in that idea of an account for someone. So maybe you're just, selling plants, pots for plants, and that's all you're doing right now. But maybe eventually you'll sell pots for plants that have humidity sensors embedded in them so that the pot starts to glow every time that plant needs to be watered. Because right now it's a whole bunch of different things that people are sticking into the pots, and then maybe you decide, hey, I want a piece of that market, I'll do that. But that means you have to start to build an entire data layer for your products and your services and your e-commerce platform that you hadn't necessarily thought about. And it means in the packaging, you have to start to communicate to people, okay, well, this is connected to the internet, and maybe one day we will no longer, we'll cap it at like 2 years data, and that's about all we can afford, and we're not going to pass that cost on to you, but if you want more data, then maybe you can pay us a little bit more, and then we can store more data for you. Again, these conversations are not necessarily happening now, but they will be eventually. And the idea that you have to have an API for all of this, which is back to my point about, openness. And the idea of an API is kind of also a really tricky thing for some people. So Transport for London, where I am, they had an API, they opened up their API, and a game called Chromorama was created, which is a game that you played with your Oyster card, so your travel card. You touched in, touched out, and then you were able to kind of play this game virtually with other players. And at some point, they decided to randomly change their API, and so it completely broke the game. And the company had to go over to TfL and say, like, hey, that change you made, like, it completely broke this game for thousands of people who were playing this game. And mostly because once you publish an API, that's it. You can kind of go like, hey, use this data and knock yourself out. But there is no real conversation that happens with the people querying that and the people providing that API. And Transport for London's real sort of the effect of the API for them, what they saw was that the traffic to their main website dropped by half. And that's the only result that they can see, as opposed to the tens of thousands of people whose lives have changed because they're kind of using other apps or using products or using kind of byproducts of that API. So for the provider of connected razor blades, and Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and whoever those companies will be, that conversation about, okay, well, there's an API there, people will build stuff on top of that. People might even build competing products on top of that. But how do we know? How do we know what they're doing? How do we know to take advantage of that or to support that or to actually play with those emerging marketplaces? Again, conversations that aren't necessarily happening. And so the openness in the Internet of Things is going to become really important, because unless you have openness, then you don't, if you don't have openness, people don't share, and people can't build on top of what you're doing. They can't learn from your mistakes. They can't sort of try to interact with you in ways that aren't completely commercially driven. And so the openness is really, really important. A lot of the principles that I've shared were actually merged out of a day called the Open Internet of Things Assembly, which was run in June 2012. I suggest you have a look at that. All these slides are online, so don't worry about it. So how does this work, or how do you kind of get involved? And when you look at an Internet of Things product, there's kind of layers. There's a stack there, in the same way that there's a stack with the web. So you've got chipsets, you've got dev boards, you've got a cloud platform, an application you might use if you're using kind of the mobile phone to do something in the real world, and then the product that you might create. And the fun thing is that 90% of this you can get involved in. The chipset bit of it, it's more tricky because basically you just have to pick someone's chip. So you'll pick a chipset from Atmel or from ARM or from Intel. Everybody's sort of excited by this, and everybody's developing chipsets for the Internet of Things right now. If you then want to build something, a little prototype, then you can pick an Arduino, you can pick a Raspberry Pi, you can kind of pick a number of different platforms that do a number of different things, and will allow you to communicate with the web in a really simple way, connect up your sensors, and then package that up in an interesting way. That might mean that there's an experience there that's relevant for people. And then the cloud side of things, so if you don't want to build your own infrastructure, because you can't be bothered, then there's loads of people, like these nice people, who are building cloud services for the Internet of Things. And there's about 40 of them. Again, I've documented this through the years. Xively is quite a good one. If This Then That is super simple. If you've used it for online stuff, it also works perfectly well for connecting devices. ThingWorks is another one, and then Berg Cloud is another one as well. And then the apps and product side of things is obviously, what you do for a living. So the idea that you have an app that maybe talks to something in the real world, or, you put your phone next to something and then it lights something up that then tells your loved one that something's happened. All of that is the realm of the known and the possible. So why get involved? Why try to do this at all? Mostly because of the platforms that exist now for promoting your product. In the same way that if you do something interesting online, you build a website really quickly, then it's out there, you just need TechCrunch to notice it, and then you're good to go. In the case of connected products, the kind of pool of people who are really looking into this and really interested in this are all looking at Kickstarter or similar crowdfunding platforms. And they're there to encourage you, and they're there to help you fund the thing that you're trying to do. And really, when you start to sort of list all of the activities involved in trying to make something and trying to ship something in the real world, you're only probably talking about 6 months worth of work. It's a lot longer than designing a website or a web service, but it's still pretty short compared to what it used to be, which used to be years and years and years. So your proof of concept prototype could take you 2 weeks, and then you've got a friend who could make you a nice video. You post it up on Kickstarter, you do really well, you get a little bit of funding, and then you spend the next 4 months just shipping the thing to your customers. And it feels ambitious perhaps, but that's kind of what's happening constantly right now. Whether that turns into actual business is an entirely different question, and I could talk about that for another 50 minutes, but we don't have another 50 minutes. So the downsides, of course, is that world's more expensive. So the cost of making things and the cost of making things at scale is a lot more expensive than building a website, of course. But that also means that it's highly exciting, and people are willing to work with you in ways that perhaps they're not online. You have to reach out to people with completely new sets of skills. So electronics engineers, product designers, industrial designers, people who do certification, lots of new people who you'll have to interact with, which also makes this really exciting, I think. It takes longer, it's more expensive, and geography matters. So where you are in the world and where the team is actually matters a lot more than it does online. Online, you can kind of work with some guy who's in Romania and some guy who's in San Francisco and like whatever, because everybody's reading emails, it's fine. With stuff like this, you really want to be in the same room, and you really want to have, all the energy there, and you want to have all the sets of skills right there in the same room. There's lots of horror stories around people who've used electronics engineers in other countries, and then the guy just disappears or has a nervous breakdown or lots of different things like that. I can also talk about that later. But this is so, this is such an exciting field simply because it is full of unknown, and it is full of success stories, it's full of failures, but that also means that there's a high degree of excitement and high degree of potential in ways that I think the web no longer necessarily has. I think the web is a space that is kind of known now. People know what to do, and people know where to innovate and know where the cracks are, whereas this is kind of crazy land right now. You have people making internet-connected onesies for babies. There's just crazy stuff happening, and so I like the crazy, personally. I think it makes things more exciting, but I think we need people like you, and we need people who understand how to handle data and who understand how to handle this idea of big data and how this connects back into products, because it affects businesses. So it's no longer just about the user journey, but it's also about what you do and how you handle all that data side of things. With that, I think that's it. I think I'm like super early, but I thought I would give us a chance to have a chat. Thank you very much.